And then there were two. These Super Bowl competitors are set. We are talking everything from offensive coordinator jobs, Senior Bowl, an interesting interaction on social media with Michael Thomas during the AFC and NFC championships. There's a whole lot to get into on Inside Black and Gold. Steve Geller along with Jeff Nowak. Just when you thought we were kind of heading into a dull, kind of down part of the season, there's always some ways to spark it up. It's amazing what Mike Thomas can do to light up your timeline on Twitter.
I just wanted a nice, calm Sunday where I sat and watched football games, and it is funny. It really kind of derailed my entire brain yesterday. I was in a mode to do a certain thing and just kind of watch football and not think about Saints drama. And then I had the entire day I was just spiraling, trying to wrap my head around, trying to come up with how I felt about it. I didn't tweet about it in the moment, because I really kind of just wanted to think about it. Yeah, and come up with okay, how do I really feel about this? Because it is very nuanced and complicated. There are layers to this, and we're going to talk about it extensively. But first, NFC Championship, man, the Lions, brutal. I mean, 24/7. The funny thing is, 24/7 is the Lions' nightmare score, because they were up 24/7 on the Saints at halftime in that game. And, if it wasn't for some pretty crazy things that happened in that game, they might have blown that game. I mean, wow. The Saints had the ball down 6. And then if you recall that crazy fumble where Derek Carr, and they had all the momentum. And then Derek Carr goes to toss it, but James Hurst comes through and knocks it out. And that's a crazy fumble. And then the Lions go in and score, right? Who knows what would have happened if that play didn't go. And then the Saints still had a chance, and Derek Carr got knocked out of the game, and it was Jameis at the end. But even he had a touchdown drive, and they had 24/7 is not a score that Lions fans will ever want to see again in terms of halftime. And a lot of the criticism is going to be on Dan Campbell and the fourth down decisions. And how do you feel about that? What is your take on that? Because I know a lot of people have a lot of opinions, and I'm curious where you land on it.
There's sometimes you do just have to take the points, Dan. I'm sorry. You can't just, I don't know. I thought his aggressive nature caught up to him again in this game. And I think
why do you have to take the points then? What's different about then?
You're on the road in a big playoff situation, and you're trying to, extend that lead for me. I wish he would have been a little less aggressive than usual, but I get it. That's Dan Campbell's nature. But to me, you got to take points and keep laying it on the Niners. Don't let them try and get in it at all.
Yeah. See, and I understand that.
There's the flip side of, okay, yeah, you're trying to step on their throat with another touchdown, but
Well, there's two things. One, we're talking about Michael Badgley as if this is a for sure kick in either situation that's going to go in.
Right.
And that's one thing that annoys me, is we always talk about something as if the alternative would definitely have worked out, and we don't even need to consider that it is not 100% scenario for Michael Badgley to make a 48-yard kick, right? So we can start there, and that has to be part of the conversation. Two, I don't see, you're talking about if this was week 13, you would do this because you believe in this, and because it's the NFC Championship, you change. And I would argue the opposite. If you believe in something and this is your philosophy, then no, you don't change it just because the situation, if you don't do it every time it gets scary, then you never believed in it in the first place. And so to me personally, I get it. I understand why people are well, this is such a big game, and you have eyes on this game that didn't watch the Lions all season and might not necessarily appreciate that this is how they have gotten to this point. That's how they did it. There's a reason they do that, and it's worked. And it's not going to work every time, but neither is the field goal. So to me personally, it's if this was just something they did in the moment and it was against all of their philosophies and beliefs throughout the entire season, that's one thing. But to me, it's if you've watched the Lions all year, you knew they were going to go there.
Right.
And changing that at that point, if Dan doesn't go and then Michael Badgley misses a 48-yard kick, the conversation is going to be about, well, why did you go away from the things that you believed in that moment And also this is a team that's been very good on fourth down conversions. Like I look at it and say, you got to convert, you got to do your job. Josh Reynolds can't be dropping that ball. You can't let an easy interception bounce off your face mask. Oof. Right? Like you can't fumble in that situation if you're Jahmyr Gibbs. Like there's a lot of reasons they that blew that lead, but like it's easy to just look at it and say, well, they were too aggressive here. And because those are the decisions you can make. You can't go back and say, well, I wish Jahmyr didn't decide to fumble. You know, I wish so-and-so didn't decide to let a ball bounce off his face mask. That's not how it works. So personally, it's like, if that's what you do, I get it. And because of the high profile nature of this game, everyone's going to be like, well, sometimes you just got to take the points. But like, what's different about this game if you're just taking the game part of it?
No, I was saying the same thing during the Cowboys game with the Lions Cowboys game. Like, right? Dan, just freaking kick the ball.
Yeah.
And no, he just wanted to keep going for it.
And I think most Lions fans would probably like, because they've watched his team so closely and like they know he's going to go. They know. And you know, this team, I'm sure they work extensively on these plays. Like if you're a team that goes for it on fourth down, you're going to be working on fourth down conversion plays constantly, so they feel good about them. Anyway, I just thought that's going to be a topic for the entire offseason. It's going to be a topic for Dan Campbell's entire coaching tenure because he's going to keep doing it.
Right? You want to say, I don't know. Does he have a nickname yet? As like Riverboat Ron did?
Dan Gamble.
Dan Gamble. There you go.
Yeah, it's a good one. I like it.
It works.
It exists for a reason. Anyway, let's in the opposite side of things. Pat Mahomes. It's almost not even worth talking about because Pat Mahomes' floor is the AFC Championship. He's never done anything less than that. He's lost to Tom Brady and Joe Burrow. Otherwise, that's it. And so they beat the Ravens. But the thing we want to talk about out of that game is not necessarily the game. As far as the Saints are concerned, we can talk about Lamar Jackson, whatever. This isn't that podcast. But what I will talk about is a tweet storm that began.
Man.
And the prompt of the tweet storm from Michael Thomas is important because it's really just an extension of what Mike was talking about during the game against the Lions in his tweet. His initial tweet that set everything off for himself was that they were talking about how Pat Mahomes used his eyes to get somebody open. And against the Lions, he was talking about how Derek Carr doesn't use his eyes or his eyes don't work or whatever. So like realistically speaking, this was a just continuation of that rant, which ended with him deactivating his Twitter account after going off in what I would assume was the team being like, guy, you can get fined if you continue to do this or something like that, right? Like, because he why did he stop then? But yeah, and so that just continued, and I think it gave a pretty solid insight into, what all Mike and the team were kind of feuding about throughout the year. And, there's a lot to it. We'll put these up here.
I feel like we need like really dramatic music behind it.
Yeah. And so some of these were replies. Some of these were quote tweets. Some of these were just straight up tweets. But I did think there was a few that were interesting in that. So, he talked about how it was a bad ball from Derek Carr that got him hurt. We were just talking about this off air. I don't know, exactly which ball he's talking about, because the weird thing is what I would call a bad ball would have been the first play of that Vikings game where it was kind of high and it needed to be like on his inside hip so he could turn upfield, and instead he took a shot to the back. But I don't think that's what he got hurt on. And the next one was just a quick slant where someone put a helmet on his knee. And I wouldn't say that was a bad ball. Like they weren't both the same. One of them was objectively like you're just setting your guy up to get hurt. But the one he got hurt on was just kind of your run-of-the-mill slant, that if that's a bad ball, then every slant is a bad ball because you're just going to get hit. But, he talked about, he probably would have had 1,000 yards, blah, blah, blah. But the thing that I thought was interesting is this is the first time I've heard or I've seen Mike come out and indicate that it wasn't just Derek Carr not throwing the ball in the right spot. It's that he wasn't emphasized enough in the offense to begin with. And it's not just Derek Carr. Like the wording of this tweet is on top of that, they wasn't even trying to get me the ball, but it's no denying my style of play. It don't age. Playa, you will see. And to me, it's like he said they. He didn't say Derek. He said they, which to me indicates that he was displeased at not just Derek, at the offense, at Pete Carmichael, at the scheme, that he was not emphasized enough as the top receiver in this offense. And to that, I would say, well, yeah.
I'm sorry, Mike. That's not who you are.
Your game does age. You're 30, dude. You're 30. I mean, and like, I get it. You're still a very good receiver, and I'm a huge Mike Thomas fan. But if you can't accept the fact that you are not the 2019 version of yourself, and sacrifice a bit for the team in terms of target share, with Chris Olave now on your team, like, this isn't Ted Ginn, right? Like, this is Chris Olave's team now. Like, the same way when you showed up, it was your team and not Brandon Cook's team, and they traded away Brandon Cooks. So that one I don't understand, but like, I think it does illuminate a lot. It does illuminate a lot in terms of why this devolved so quickly. And I want to draw your attention to a couple Derek Carr clips that happened throughout the season. And at the time I was like, I don't know if he's talking to me or not. I don't know if this is in reference to what I'm asking him or what he's hearing. And this is what I mean. So this is the answer to a question that I asked him prior to the Bears game. And so basically, like, he's spreading the ball around a lot, more so than we saw with Drew Brees pretty much ever in the last, pretty much since 2017. Like, since Mike Thomas joined the Saints, you would never say this is a team that spread the ball around. It was an offense that ran through Mike Thomas, and you just made everything work around it. And Alvin Kamara, obviously. But with Derek Carr, you definitely saw, a lot of games where it's like, wow, 8 different guys caught passes, but you never saw like that huge, oh, this guy had 15 targets today, right? And so I asked him about that, and this is what he said.
Done a good job of spreading the ball around a lot this year. Is that something as a quarterback that you kind of have to, when you have this many playmakers on an offense, do you have to be conscious of, or does it just kind of happen naturally?
No, I kind of, like I told y'all when I came, we taught you guys teaching me about the playmakers, and I said, look, I'm going to read plays out, and the ball, we're going to say, wow, he had a great game. Then the next week we're going to, wow, we had a great game. What's wrong with this guy? What's wrong? Why can't we do? And I just said, like, just the way I play, man, I'm just going to spread them out and leave it up to the coaches to put guys in position, and hopefully I can read them all right and get it to the guy when they're supposed to get it and all those things. But that's just me playing quarterback. Like, if you guys want to get mad, go talk to them. But I'm going to read plays out, and I'm going to throw it to where the ball should go. AK could have 12 catches. Mike, you could have 10 one time. You could get 3 in a row. You could, however it plays out, we have to be able to play that way. That way, as quarterback, you can be free in the decisions that you're making.
Okay, so that was before the Bears game, right? Now, this is what he said after the Bears game.
Hey, look.
And bear in mind, this is in reference to a question about Chris Olave, who had a big game against the Bears.
We are all human. We go through stuff, and sometimes it's, there's change. He's, getting to know me, and there's things, that we deal with players in our personal life and things like that. And who knows what's going on? And sometimes you could be doing everything right, and it doesn't go your way. We all know that in life, And so I think that he's still been making, some big plays for us, and making some tough catches and things like that. But to see him have a touchdown, see him have a couple big plays for us, get the ball back in his hands, that was good. And again, he goes back to what I've been saying since I got here. Some days it's going to be that way, where oh wow, Chris, and oh man, Mike had 8 catches, or Sheed, or and man, Alvin got the ball a whole bunch. I just am going to read the plays out and try my best to make it happen. And it just happened to go that way for Chris today, but it's good timing, I think, for him.
And now this is one more clip from his post game after the Giants game. Now, keep in mind, this is a game without Chris or Mike.
The tight end involved a lot. Was that matchup specific, or is that something you've been pushing to do in recent years?
Yeah, I think it just fell that way this week. Obviously, with 12 being out, other guys' roles, like I said, increase, and we got some good players in that room, and they're healthy, and as can be right now, and that was an emphasis for us is, with him being out, how can we, involve everybody, and I really think it was a masterful job by Pete, you know, NRC just, you know, spreading that out, you know, and putting guys in positions to do some things where the defense thinks they're doing one, you do another, you know, and I just thought they did a fantastic job of including everybody, because I told you, like, if any receivers or tight ends come up to me, I'm going to point them right back to RC and Pete, like, go talk to them, because I'm going to read these plays out, you know. And our guys have been great, and everyone made their plays when they were called on today.
Okay, so again, and the part of those that I want to point to is each time he basically said, if receivers come up to me and say, why didn't I get the ball? I'm going to point them back to Ronald Curry, Pete Carmichael, and say, I'm just reading these plays. And he said that consistently. And to his credit, you have seen him do that for the most part. Again, like, he spread the ball around this season. And in most cases, you would talk about a quarterback spreading the ball around and say, yeah, it's a good thing. Now, let's go back to Mike Thomas. And this is a guy who, you know, part of what makes him great is this kind of insane work ethic, this super intense personality, and that's what a lot like has helped him be the guy he is. I think now that's working against him in terms of being a less emphasized piece of this offense. And I think what you have here, and the reason that him saying, well, why am I not as emphasized in this offense is important, is so you're going through the season, you're getting into week 7, week 8, and things, you know, week 8 was a good win over the Colts, but in a lot of the other weeks, the offense had bogged down. You had a few issues. You'd start with 3 and outs. You struggle in the first half. And Mike's like, well, why am I not a bigger part of the game? Why am I not the guy that we look at and say, okay, you know, this is someone who can get the offense moving. And so he goes to Derek Carr. And again, like, we heard how Derek Carr responds to those complaints. He says, I just read the play out, throw to the open guy. So you're Mike Thomas and you're like, oh, okay, sure thing. Now, fast forward to week 9, and that's the reason that the fact that those comments came before and after the Bears game. Week 9, Saints win, but it's ugly on offense. You force 5 turnovers. You win by a touchdown against the Bears team that's starting Tyson Bagent. And Mike Thomas, 0 catches, 1 target, and it went down as a drop. So what do you think happened on the sideline or in the locker room around that game? Why the hell aren't you throwing me the ball? Well, I just read the plays out. Okay, go to the next week against the Vikings, and you have the first 2 offensive plays of the game are quick throws to Mike Thomas. One is the bad ball where he gets delivered high and he gets a shot right in the kidneys. But, you know, again, it's not, I don't know if that's the play he got injured on, because I don't think he injured his knee on that. The next play was the quick slant where he takes a helmet to the knee and that ends his season. Now, I don't know how significant that injury is, but I don't know if Mike Thomas could have come back and played. The team clearly thought that he could have got back and played after the injury. We'll never know. Only Mike knows exactly how bad that injury was. And I'm not going to sit here and say that he was healthy enough to play. I don't know. But what I will sit here and say is that once you start tweeting about your quarterback while they're playing a game, you've decided you're not going to play. So in my mind, whether he could have played or not is irrelevant, because he wasn't going to come back and play. Because if he was, he would have been back at practice in terms of like getting ready in case he could have played. Like if they made the postseason, he could have come back in week 18 and getting through limited practices so that if they made the playoffs, maybe he could have come back. So to me, he decided he's no longer a member of this team. And so you're like, he's sitting there on the couch saying like, oh, you said you throw to the open guys. Well, A.T. Perry's wide open. And this is what set off this whole thing initially. A.T. Perry's wide open. You didn't throw him the ball. So apparently your eyes aren't working perfectly. And I think that's where you get to this point of like, I don't trust you that you're doing your job the right way, but you're telling me you are, and that's why I'm not getting the ball. So I think there's truth to both sides of this. And I know I've been talking forever, but this is just something that I think is very interesting. And the question is, okay, well, as a coach, as a team, as a front office, how do you handle this? Because what are you supposed to do? I mean, you have a veteran player who is not pulling in the right direction. Like, I think he started this season pulling in the right direction. At a certain point, he took his hands off the rope. And then later on, he put his hands back on the rope and started pulling the opposite direction. And I understand why he did, but at the same time, how am I supposed to endorse that? Like, you look at this team and you see how this season went, And do you think it's a coincidence that over the final 5 weeks of the season, 6 weeks of the season, Chris Olave was playing his best football? That the offense played its best football? I don't know. But like, Mike, it was never going to be about you are the clear-cut number one receiver on this team. This was only going to work if Mike was willing to sacrifice that role and be the guy that he can be, which is a productive member of this offense. Because I hate to break it to you, Mike, you're going to play somewhere else. If you are not willing to be that guy for that team, it's not going to work out there either. You're not going to go to Kansas City and they're suddenly going to be like, yeah, you're the unquestioned guy. You're not going to go to Buffalo and they're going to be like, Stefan Diggs, move over. We got Mike Thomas. No, you're going to have to be part of that group. And I don't know if he can do it.
You mentioned separation numbers. I thought you were going to hammer those because it's unbelievable.
Well, and I don't want it. Like, I think Mike is a very good player. I think he can still catch a ball in a phone booth. He can battle for it. But if his argument is that he
had a lot of drops this year,
I don't know. It's tough. And I think like his stats at the end, that 39 catches, 448 yards and a touchdown, you're on pace for 71 catches, 827 yards, like 3 touchdowns. It's like, to me, that was fine. Like, I didn't have an issue with it. That's why I was surprised to hear him complaining about his role. But like, if his argument is that he's open and he's not getting seen, like I'm sure you could go back and find situations where he's open and not getting the ball. I'm sure you could. There was a play that Juwan Johnson got the ball over the middle. Mike Thomas was running an out or whatever it was. And he dropped his defensive back. And if Carr had seen him, he gets it over there. It's a touchdown. But if you look at just the average separation numbers in the NFL, which Next Gen Stats, the NFL tracks this, you know who's dead last in average separation this season? It's Mike.
And we saw that issue be frustrating for him in training camp.
Right. He's tied with Devontae Parker for the lowest average separation in the NFL. And like, I don't think Mike is a guy who doesn't have to be wide open to get the ball. And I think that's what he would say to you is like, I don't need 5 yards of separation. I just need an inch and then you can get it to me and I'll win that catch. But like, it's not as if he's just standing there by himself, and I think one of the things that Derek did well this year is not put the ball in harm's way, not put the ball in trouble. Because when you're throwing into contested windows, you set yourself up for potential tips, that sort of thing. And so it's not like he was just standing there wide open. Now, could you have forced him the ball? Yes. Back when Drew was here, he was the only guy to throw the ball to. Like, you don't get 149 catches in a season if there's a guy across from you that isn't Ted Ginn, right? Like, I just think that it was always a struggle. And to me, it kind of boils down to, like, I've said this before, what is the actual consequence of managing the salary cap the way the Saints do? Because I don't think it's necessarily the roster suffers significantly in terms of, talent. Yeah, I think it just keeps you locked into guys, and it stops you from being able to be flexible when you get into situations like this. And Mike is not the first, and he will not be the last wide receiver who gets into his 30s and suddenly feels like, well, why is the offense going away from me? I'm still me. But like, you have to be able to navigate that. And some teams do it well. Some teams don't. You look at Des Bryant, right? When Des Bryant left the Cowboys, they were able to cut bait and move on quickly. They didn't have to worry about the long-term ramifications of the salary cap and whatnot. He obviously comes here and everyone's like, well, why did they move on from Des Bryant so suddenly? He comes here, blows out his Achilles. We'll never know if he had anything to give, but like, I don't think you look back and say, well, they were wrong to do that. Pittsburgh moved on from Antonio Brown way back when he went to the Raiders, and everyone was like, wow, I can't believe the Steelers moved on from Antonio Brown. He still has so much to offer. And then we kind of find out a lot more about Antonio Brown. He shows up in Oakland, to go play with Derek Carr, and he's like burns his feet. He like remember he like freezes his feet. Do you remember that?
Yeah, there's a pretty wild stuff going on with him.
He showed up with his like feet melting off his body.
Right.
And then he dyes his like walrus mustache and it becomes a whole thing, right? Never worked out there. And so like, it's one of those things that as guys get older, these are primary players. These are guys who are what they are because they say, I'm better than you and I'm going to prove it to you. And so I think it can be difficult for those guys to suddenly feel like, well, why are they running this offense around Chris Olave and not me? Why are they doing this? And then put yourself in the shoes of the organization that's like, we have these impressionable young players who are now seeing this guy who's supposed to be a veteran arguing with the quarterback about why he's not getting enough targets, right? And sniping at the quarterback and the team on social media, about how they did him wrong. And it's like, if the other part of all this is he feels like the team is trying to set him up to be the scapegoat for their problems. And he mentioned Jeff Duncan and how, he's kind of the mouthpiece of the organization. And to be fair, he is to an extent. Like, he does have people talking to him and he reports that information. But, it's hard to, if Mike wants his voice heard in that story, he's got to talk to the media about it. Like he doesn't have to, but it's hard for me to take you seriously when you never really talk to the media ever. And then you're saying, well, they only report what the organization is telling them. Like, yeah, because you're not telling us your side of the story. And I'm not saying you need to hold a press conference, but look at what Jameis did last year. I Jameis was in a very similar situation of kind of getting screwed over by the team. And he did an interview with New Orleans Football, which apparently Mike is a big fan of.
Mike's just a peculiar character in that aspect where he doesn't want to talk to the media, but he likes to take those little jabs or whatever you want to misinterpret his rap lyrics whenever he does tweet those out, to just be really cryptic about things. And I really would appreciate if he was a little more straightforward in what he was trying to say.
Well, I will give him credit. The reason we're talking about him today is because he was very straightforward. So if that's your complaint, then he is doing what you want him to do. There's no questioning.
For whatever reason, Championship Sunday just set him off.
Well, it's not about a new rant. It's the same rant. And that's why, a lot of people will hinge on this and say, oh, it's a smoking gun. Everything's gone to shit in down on airline. And I would say, what did we actually learn that we didn't know already? Like, we knew Mike was pissed off. We knew it wasn't going well. And he basically was off the team by week 12. Like, well, that's not new. We know it goes a little deeper than that. And like, again, one of the reasons I talked about like the offensive part of it was that's new to me in terms of, I knew that he was already complaining about Derek not throwing the ball to the right place. I didn't realize that he was actively complaining about his role in the offense. And I think that is significant, but I kind of look at it and say, how are you supposed to handle this situation as a team? Right? Because this isn't the first time, and it won't be the last time that a player kind of goes off and starts becoming an issue in the locker room. Like we saw it with CJ, right? Like when things aren't going the right way, how do you handle it? Some guys handle it certain ways.
I don't know what kind of teammate Mike is. I'm not saying he's a distraction, but some of the things he does can be, perceived as negative towards the organization, obviously.
I said this before. I think Mike, to his teammates, is an excellent teammate. I think, other than Derek Carr, probably, he would support everyone in that locker room. And that's kind of an about face from his initial reaction and kind of what we saw in the beginning, which he did reference that in his tweet storm, where he was like, I was standing in the middle of the ocean. I was feeling great about life. And it's kind of funny. But, but at the same time, your actions speak a lot louder than I think you realize when you are Mike fucking Thomas and you are undermining the coaching staff, undermining your quarterback in front of a lot of very, very impressionable young players. And go look at Chris Olave's season, right? And understand that this is a young player who's trying to find his way and trying to learn how to be a professional in real time. And he had a very difficult stretch in the middle of this season. And that coincided with what sure sounds like the bulk of Mike's ire being directed at quarterback Derek Carr, or at head coach Dennis Allen, and offensive coordinator Pete Carmichael, whatever was going on with Cody Burns. That firing makes a lot more sense now that we kind of have more of this information. And like, how is he handling that? That's what frustrates me about it. Is one of the reasons I really liked the idea of keeping Mike around was that he could guide Chris Olave and kind of if he's willing to kind of take a backseat at points, then you have a young player who I think is going to be a superstar in the NFL for a long time. And he's learning at the feet of a very, very, very good, at one point, elite, top end, 99 in Madden type player. And instead, what you got was this dysfunction and sniping and things that didn't work. And again, I don't think it's a coincidence that the end of Chris Olave's season went very much differently. I mean, look at the first game Mike missed. He basically disappeared from the team for the second half of that season, from week 11 on. And the first week Mike's not there, you see Chris go off for 9 catches, 114 yards against Falcons.
Yeah, I mean, I think Mike didn't really, I don't know if it didn't fully grasp what role he was supposed to be in now, but I thought that was pretty crystal clear going into the season. But it's not obviously what he wanted. But I don't understand, or really, I don't know how you get to a place where you're making him happy.
You don't. There's no place. And that's the problem, is like, I think if everyone took a step back prior to this season, we could have all kind of seen this as a likely ending point.
Right.
But both sides were tied to each other financially in ways that, the same as Jameis Winston, it made a heck of a lot more sense to keep him than to move on from him. Now, when I say sense, I mean that financially, right? Like
right.
From a team building perspective, it made more sense to go with a youth movement and maybe go sign a veteran wide receiver and say, good, Mike, you've done a heck of a lot here. We appreciate you. The other thing he talked about was like Alex Anzalone was injury prone and they got rid of him, which I thought was interesting. But, because I do want to see Mike succeed, and I want to see Mike go somewhere where he can go win a Super Bowl. But, like Odell Beckham does not win a Super Bowl with the Rams unless he humbles himself and says, okay, I'll be a sidekick to Cooper Kupp. Right? Like,
right. And I think pretty clear that Mike's ego still won't let him do that.
But I don't think he's alone in that. I think he's one of the few guys who's willing to air his grievances on social media. And so we know a lot more about it. But like Odell Beckham got traded from the Giants. You think that was an amicable departure? But like he went to the Browns and that didn't go well. Like his dad is sniping it. Like his dad was the one who used social media and sent cut-ups of Odell being wide open and Baker Mayfield ignoring him. Then he eventually goes to the Rams, and I think he understands where he is at this point in his career. Odell Beckham's 31. Odell Beckham's a year older than Mike Thomas. But, and he's on the Ravens now, and he got fewer catches than Mike Thomas did this year. He got 3 catches in the playoffs, the entire playoffs.
I just think the Mike Thomas soap opera in New Orleans, the run is over, and it's time for the next season to pick up with a new location.
Yeah, and again, it should have happened a while ago. And if it wasn't for the contract, it would have.
Yeah, they tried to make it work this year for sure.
Yeah. And so, it is what it is. I don't know how much we learned that was new. Like, again, it was obviously bad. The other funny thing that happened is Alvin Kamara was like, leave me out of this. I don't want
I don't even watch
football. Yeah. Alvin has said we asked Alvin after the Lions game, and he was like, if that's what Mike wants to do, that's what he's going to do. And he tweeted yesterday, he was like, I don't even watch football. Leave me out of this. Because Alvin has said he's a NASCAR
Alvin's
guy.
busy with NASCAR stuff now.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like, and I get it, and I don't want to trash Mike. I like Mike. I think Mike is a great player. I think he's one of the best wide receivers the Saints have ever had. I think he's one of the best wide receivers in NFL history, and it's really a shame that his career got derailed by injuries. That said, I can't support that. I can't support.
And I think those injuries, obviously, what happened and, the misdiagnosis or whatever you want to say, I think a lot of that angst is still harbored around this team. That's what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, people are going to sit there and say, oh, this is Dennis Allen's fault. This is what happens when Dennis Allen takes over.
No.
Go back to 2020 and remember that this almost became a huge rift at that point. When Mike is yelling at Jeff Duncan, that's relative to that. When the injury and the surgery didn't happen as the team might have expected, and there were stories about the miscommunications and all this, like that started well when Sean Payton was here. And, like you tried to massage it, but it clearly was never massaged well enough.
We also had players fighting, C.J. Gardner-Johnson and Michael Thomas.
While Sean Payton was here.
There you go. Exactly. So he's had some, like I said, there's been some angst around here. Yeah,
like people are going to point to this and say this is a Dennis Allen thing, and I would say this has been building for a long time.
Right.
And so you could say it got exacerbated while Dennis Allen was here. I would argue that this is a product of, sure, Dennis Allen. So he's on the defensive side of the ball. There's only so much he's going to be able to do, and not having that strong leader in the offensive meeting room and that's why, like, that's my biggest criticism of Pete Carmichael is I just like, if Michael Thomas is out there throwing a fit about he's not getting the ball, what is Pete saying? I understand. Right. How is he handling that situation?
Well, I think this.
yeah, right. And I understand the grievances around Derek Carr, and I do think that ball was a bad ball, but again, it wasn't the one he got hurt on. But at the same time, again, it's like, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I agree that this offense would have been better if he force-fed the ball to Michael Thomas 15 times a game rather than work the ball around to his playmakers, to the other receivers, to Rashid Shaheed, to Chris Olave. Now, when things aren't going well, it's easy to say, yeah, well, I'm still Mike Thomas, throw me the freaking ball. But I don't think that was the issue with the offense. I don't.
This is one, too. Everyone's going to go, oh, he's going to end up in Denver. I don't know how that relationship is with Sean Payton, honestly.
He's not going to Denver. No way.
I don't think so either.
They're not friends.
Right. It's not like, oh, come on in, my boy.
Yeah. I mean, I think he would have left after 2020 again if it wasn't like a lot of this is contract driven. And yeah, so
good luck getting paid somewhere, Mike, but I definitely won't be in black and gold again. I don't think, at least.
I think he's going to end up in Buffalo, personally.
Might be too cold for that knee. I don't know.
I wouldn't want to go to Buffalo, but
right.
We'll see. But anyway, let's wrap that up. We talked for a long time, but it's good. Maybe it's the last time we talk about Michael Thomas. We want to get our money's worth.
I was gonna say Mike T brings that out of you for sure.
He got his money's worth, so we're gonna get our money's worth. We're gonna come back, and I had a long interview with Justin Melo, senior draft analyst from the Draft Network, talking about the Senior Bowl, which is starting on Tuesday. I'm gonna be driving up there, getting a look at some of these prospects in the practices, and I don't stay for the game, but I mean, the game is like the least important part of Senior Bowl weekend, which is kind of funny. But we're gonna get into a lot of that. So this is Inside Black and Gold. This is gonna be a long episode, I can tell already. Stick around. And we're back on Inside Black and Gold. I am Jeff Nowak. He is Steve Geller, but Steve's going to take a back seat for a little while because I'm going to play a recorded interview that I did on Friday, I think. Yeah, on last Friday with Justin Melo of the Draft Network. It was really good. It was a little long. We played a good chunk of it on Sports Talk on Friday, but there's a lot of it left, a lot of interesting topics to mine. So here's that. Enjoy. Jeff Nowak, WWL Radio Saints sideline reporter. We're bringing in Justin Melo, senior draft analyst with the Draft Network. Going to talk some Senior Bowl, some prospects. Always a fascinating time of year for the Saints in particular, because you could talk about the Senior Bowl. There's always a lot of prospects there, but the Saints always seem to end up with at least one or two Senior Bowl prospects every year. I think I did the math last year. I added it all up. And going back to 2000, they've picked something like 53 Senior Bowl participants. Sometimes it's in the first round, like a Marcus Davenport or a Peyton Turner. Sometimes it's in the mid rounds. Sometimes it's, we scouted this guy 3 years ago and now he's a free agent. We're bringing him in. The Colin Saunders, Nathan Shepard, Tano Passanio, those were all Senior Bowl guys that they got a second pass at and brought him in. And so I guess, Justin, what makes the Senior Bowl such a useful event for some of these teams? Because you don't see the top end guys like Caleb Williams isn't there, but you do end up with Bo Nix, Michael Penix, guys like that who, you just need a closer look at. And I'm just curious, what is it about the Senior Bowl that does lead to that? Because there are a ton of players picked out of the Senior Bowl every year.
Well, I think it's the unprecedented access that teams get to prospects at the Senior Bowl. I mean, if you've ever been there, it's an open hall event, essentially, right? Where the best of the best, the entire league essentially flocks down there for 1 week. And certainly they've made changes. And credit Jim Nagy, because I think that's a testament to the job that he's done running that game. Certainly, I've spoken with a lot of scouts and different members of around the league that will tell you the interview process helps a lot. I think that's why you see so many players get drafted. I mean, of course, the talent that's down there every year speaks for itself. But the way that they've made changes to the interview process to be a bit more intimate, they don't run as late as they used to. So teams are finding you get a lot better time with the prospects. You're getting them in better moods. At the combine, when you've got that interview process, guys are tired, right? They've been running through drills. They've been running all week. I just find the Senior Bowl leads to a bit more of a comfortable environment for them. And I think that's partially why teams get so much more comfortable with prospects down there. And that's why, again, in addition to all the talent that's there, that's why you see so many of them drafted on a yearly. I think last year they passed 100 guys or something along those lines that were drafted. And this is the 75th year anniversary of the Senior Bowl. So there was certainly a lot of added incentive for them to put on one hell of a show. And that's exactly what they're going to do.
Yeah, and I think that is interesting because everyone wants to talk about the first round and all these top end players, but the bulk of your roster is made up of these mid round guys, these fringe guys that you have to develop over time. One change that the Senior Bowl made this year, and a change they made last year, was making sure that everyone knew that everyone's interviewing with everybody. You just can stop tweeting so and so met with this team because they're all meeting with everybody. But this year, one of the changes is juniors are now allowed to participate, which is kind of weird. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a rebranding down the road because it doesn't really make sense anymore when you're talking about it. It is also weird because typically you'd be saying, well, if you're a junior and you're coming out early, it's because you're a top end prospect, and top end prospects probably aren't ending up in Mobile. So I don't know how big that number will be, but I'm just curious what you see in that. And do you think that's going to be like a notable change? And are there any juniors there this year that are worth keeping an eye on?
There are a lot of them. And again, credit to Jim and his staff. They were fairly choosy about sort of keeping the game the way it's been structured, right? This is for seniors. So they were very choosy with which type of juniors they invited. But I'll give you one example of how it is going to benefit the Senior Bowl. It's going to benefit the level of competition. Oregon center Jackson Powers Johnson is a junior that's going to be attending this year. A lot of teams got a first round grade on this guy. I think he's the best pure overall center in the draft. I say pure overall because Graham Barton out of Duke, there's some rumors he might be a center, and if so, he'll probably contend for that center one, title. But I look at a guy like Jackson Powers Johnson, who's one of the best junior, prospects in this class, and he accepted an invite. And there are others, Penn State cornerback Kalen King is a guy teams are very excited to get a closer look at. He's someone that I think entered the year with a lot of first round buzz, maybe didn't have the season that he thought he was going to have, and now there's some second and third round chatter surrounding his name. So it's going to be very, very beneficial to a lot of these juniors who want to clean some things up, get in front of these teams, maybe improve their draft stock. And it's also beneficial to Jim and the Senior Bowl because they're getting to choose from a better overall pool of players, right? Anytime you expand the pool of players, you're going to end up with better. So I think, I spoke with Jackson Powers Johnson, who I decided to single out a couple of weeks ago. That interview is live now on the draftnetwork.com. And he spoke to me about how honored he was to be one of the first juniors ever to receive and accept an invite to this game. So certainly it's a change. We're all going to have to get used to it. But at the end, it benefits all parties involved.
Yeah, and while I'm thinking about it, if you're looking for basically a running feed of all of the information you feel like you need to know about the Senior Bowl, go follow Justin on Twitter. It's at JustinM_NFL. I was scrolling through there, come up with some questions for this interview, and it was like, oh, what about this guy? Oh, look, there's a thing about Michael Pratt. Okay, we're gonna mark that one down and keep going. But I do want to shift gears and talk a little about the quarterbacks, because one of kind of the wild cards every year at the Senior Bowl is whether there are actually quarterbacks there worth really taking the time to talk about. Last year, the biggest name was Hendon Hooker, but he didn't really play. He was just there to interview. You had guys like Jake Haener, Clayton Tune, but no one that really kind of made you excited. Well, this year you get Bo Nix and Michael Penix, two guys who are older, even by Senior Bowl standards, they'll both be 24 by the time next season rolls around. So this evaluation to me is super important for them because this is their first kind of jumping off point of like a team deciding whether you're the guy or not, right? Whether they think he can bring you in like a Jordan Love type, are you going to be that fringe first round pick where they plan to bring you in and let you learn behind somebody for a year or two? Or do you end up in the third round where it's kind of like, yeah, well, maybe we'll give him a shot and who knows, like the Malik Willises or the Kenny Pickett's, or not, actually, that's a bad example. I'm thinking more of like a Will Levis. Where is your kind of read on both of these guys? And do you think maybe they could be first round picks? Where do you see them landing in general?
First of all, credit to Jim and his staff, because this year's crop of quarterbacks is outstanding and it's significantly better than it was last year. I think Jim would probably admit that last year's, they didn't have a whole lot of selection, right, from the quarterbacks that they were able to pool. It wasn't one of their strongest years from a quarterback perspective. Well, this year, you want to talk about a bounce back. It is one of the best years I think we'll ever see at the Senior Bowl. You've talked about Michael Pratt. That's one that's really intriguing in the middle rounds. Certainly with Bo Nix and Michael Penix. One thing I want to point out, I wondered, how the coaching staff and Mr. Nagy, how they would sort of use these guys. Are they going to put them on opposite teams so we could watch them go up against one another? Well, I thought the idea was brilliant. They ended up putting them on the same team so they would throw right after one another in throwing drills. So no short-term memory loss. You want to compare one to the other? Well, you're going to see one follow up the other throughout the entire week when it comes to those practice drills. I thought that was really, really smart and shrewd. I think both guys are fringe first rounders. We certainly know how quarterbacks can rise throughout the process. With Michael Penix Jr., I think the bigger question, it's not so much the age thing. I've seen that floated around. Teams don't care about that as much, especially at quarterback when you're not a running back, right? We're not talking about a 26-year-old running back here where you worry about the tread on the tires. No, quarterbacks can play well into their mid to late 30s and play at a high level. Certainly the medicals, with back-to-back injuries in his past, I think they want to see how he throws in this controlled environment. And then even with Bo Nix being the dual threat guy that he is, talk about a guy that's shown so much growth throughout it. I mean, it's a different quarterback at Oregon than it was at Auburn, right? So I think both of them have first round potential. If we know quarterbacks climb up big boards throughout the pre-draft process, I'd be a bit more comfortable probably in the early portion of the second with them personally. I think I've still got a couple questions I'd like to see them answer at the Senior Bowl. But that's the beautiful thing about Mobile and the competition it fosters. If they both go down there and they have an outstanding week in the interview room, throwing the ball, they look accurate, they throw with anticipation. I think Penix maybe shows some of that off-script stuff that teams want to see from him. I think certainly you could talk about both of them exiting that week as bona fide first-round prospects.
Yeah, and I think it's like, okay, are you a first-round prospect in terms of the teams that are there now? And then there's a second question, are you a first-round prospect in terms of the teams that have the ammunition to go trade up to 31 or 32, where these are good teams that are just kind of, trying to rebuild some out. Anyway, it is interesting. I think that's where you get a lot of that evaluation. One guy you mentioned, Michael Pratt, is obviously interesting locally in New Orleans. He went to Tulane. Personally, I never kind of saw him. I've watched him play for a couple of years now. He's been very good in the American Athletic Conference. I've never seen him and said, wow, that's an NFL quarterback. But, as you look and you see a lot of these evaluations are saying, second, third, fourth round pick. And I'm just curious, so what did you see from him? I know you've dove in there pretty in depth. What have you seen from him that makes you think, okay, this guy could definitely be a pro, first? And second, what does he need to show to kind of grow to that? Because it's like, you're not talking about a guy who played against SEC competition. Even this year when they lost to Ole Miss, he didn't play. So I think that's a big question for me, is how would he hold up against the Alabamas or the Georgias? You just really never found out.
Well, I think he's going to have a bit of an opportunity, to address that question at the Senior Bowl, not only in the interview room, but certainly on the practice field. Even one-on-one drills, he'll be testing corners that played at Georgia and Penn State, and so you'll be able to test some of that ball placement and accuracy against some of the best corners in the nation. One thing I want to point out about Michael Pratt before I forget, that I think will be very interesting to your listener base. When I did the profile with him on the Draft Network, I asked him about a quarterback maybe that he reminds himself of, and it may qualify as a bit lofty for folks down there in New Orleans, but he said himself that he had a coach on staff there at Tulane that was previously with the New Orleans Saints that said his toughness reminded him of Drew Brees. That there were a lot of times Drew was dealing with an injury and may have played through something, and they saw a lot of that in Michael Pratt at Tulane. So certainly I think that's one that'll perk the ears up of New Orleans Saints fans. But I think he's a guy that commands an offense. He's got exceptional football IQ. I think he's extremely accurate. I think the big question for him, funny, sort of like Drew Brees, is going to be some of the physical traits, the arm strength, the arm velocity, and does he have, like Drew did, sort of the football IQ and the command to offset some of that stuff with, by throwing with great anticipation and being a great, pre-snap reader that leads to post-snap execution. So I think he'll have a chance to address some of those questions, but he's a quarterback that I'll be watching very closely.
Yeah, I imagine the coach you're talking about is Dan Rochar, because he was obviously the Saints tight ends coach for a long time, went over to Tulane this offseason. So he would definitely have, he had a bunch of different positions on the Saints staff, but he would definitely have a good idea in terms of comparing a guy to Drew. So that's an analysis I would trust, generally speaking. But, let's just kind of shifting gears again, this is the Senior Bowl, right? Like you watch, I'm very happy about what you're saying in terms of Bo Nix and Michael Penix throwing back to back, because that can be one of the difficult things is like, there's only so many places your eyes can be at one time. And so, obviously the quarterbacks are of interest, but so are the big guys, the offensive tackles, the offensive line, because the Saints have a glaring need at offensive tackle. One of the reasons is, the Trevor Penning pick obviously was a big Senior Bowl name from a couple of years ago. He has not necessarily panned out. They haven't given up on him, but he's definitely not taken over that job the way they probably hoped. And some of that's due to injuries, but whatever. Either way, the Saints are going to be going there again saying, okay, who can we pull out of here that could maybe step into a starting offensive tackle role? They pick at number 14. So you're kind of right there. This is a very tackle heavy draft in general. So my question is, of the guys who are there, who might be available at 14, is there anyone that you could see the Saints really taking a close look at and maybe targeting when the draft rolls around?
Well, there are at least, 2 or 3 of them that come to mind. Number one is the Talais Fuaga, the right tackle at Oregon State. Now, if you're looking for a left tackle, I think he'll probably be better served staying on the right. But we might be talking about the best tackle that's going to be in attendance at the Senior Bowl. He's extremely powerful. He's a mauler in the run game. He's an easy mover on his feet, considering his mammoth size. We'll remind you a little of DeJuan Jones at the Senior Bowl last year, at least from a size perspective. So he's probably the best tackle in attendance. One that I think, and the Saints fans might say, oh, that sounds like a reach to me. But one guy that I think is going to go a lot higher than people realize, and he is scheduled to attend the Senior Bowl, is Oklahoma left tackle Tyler Guyton. Tyler Guyton, and I don't say this lightly, he might have the highest upside of any tackle in this class. And I know who the other tackles are in this class. He is just that much of a freak athlete. He is as easy as a mover as you'll see on tape. Now, some of the technical stuff is still a work in progress. He is a little raw, but you get him in the right place with the right O-line coach. You work through some of those kinks. The baseline traits are just outstanding. I think we're talking about a first-round pick all day long. I'll be stunned if he doesn't go in the first round, and I do think he can go as high between that sort of 14 to 20 range. He really is that good. Another guy, 14 might be a little rich, but I do view him as a first-round pick, is Arizona Wildcats tackle Jordan Morgan. I don't think he's getting enough attention in this class. This is a really good, technically sound player, and he's a left tackle through and through. That's not a guy that you'd be asking to move positions out there in New Orleans. Even in maybe a trade back scenario, if they feel 14's a little rich, you come down to 2025, all of a sudden it's not too early for Jordan Morgan, in my opinion. So I think those 3 tackles are, in my the best that are going to be in attendance. But there are a lot of guys that are going to garner consideration in the second round too. If the Saints decide they want to wait and then maybe just add competition for Trevor Penning. Patrick Paul out of Houston's another guy that has all the traits, extremely long arms. He's exciting a lot of scouts right now. One guy that's very underrated is Dominic Pooney from Kansas, a bit of a lesser known prospect because he was playing like at I think Central Missouri a year ago, and then, transferred to Kansas this past year, had a really good year. He's getting a lot of buzz. He might be a candidate to kick inside, but that's another example of a really talented, sort of underrated tackle that's going to be in attendance. So a lot of good tackles this year. But if I was focused on first round picks, if I was the Saints, I would maybe look at Talise Fuaga, and I'd certainly look at Tyler Guyton and Jordan Morgan.
We actually, so on the podcast, we did our first mock draft this week, and Fuaga was the guy I ended up with at 14. And at that point, I was just kind of going in a little blind. I was kind of doing more of a value pick than anything else. And he ended up there, and I looked him up, and I was like, you know what, this would make a lot of sense, even though he's a right tackle. I think one of the reasons the Saints have a glaring need is because Ryan Ramczyk is a guy who you cannot maybe trust beyond this year in terms of his knee. Kind of gave out on him at the end of last season. So that's probably the biggest concern, is not only Trevor Penning, it's that you might be looking for both a left tackle and a right tackle. So I don't mind a guy who's going to stick on the right side, but you look at the measurables, you look at kind of the tape, and it's like, okay, I could see it. And then you look at the list of Senior Bowl invites, and you're like, oh, okay, now we're cooking with grease. So I think that's interesting. So I'm glad you mentioned him, because I'm very much looking forward to seeing him. But kind of just taking a broader view here, and I know you posted something along these lines recently, so I have a feeling I know a couple of your answers already. But just in terms of guys at the Senior Bowl that not necessarily tackles, you've already gone through a lot of the tackles, but guys that you think probably aren't getting talked about enough, that we're going to get into this draft process and they're going to end up being names that rise up people's boards because they're just kind of getting undervalued right now.
Well, I am going to give you a couple of names probably from that article you may have read, but I doubt all your listeners have read it, so I might as well round them off. One guy that, and this should interest your local base once again, is Jaquan Jackson from Tulane, right? I probably don't have to tell your listeners too much about him, but this guy is an exceptional dynamic playmaker in space, right? Talk about a guy that accounted for close to 1,500 yards in kickoff and punt returns throughout his career, had a punt return for a touchdown. You want to talk about an immediate contributor that's going to start on special teams, return kicks, return punts. I think he's that guy. And then I think there's a lot of untapped potential at wide receiver for him. I spoke to actually several scouts, and he told me this first. So, and I fact-checked him on it and found out he was telling the truth. There are some scouts that have compared him to Zay Flowers at wide receiver. They just think he's that twitchy and explosive. So I think, you look back at last year's Senior Bowl, Jaden Reed, Tank Dell, Rashee Rice, receivers that made themselves a lot of money throughout that week of practice by getting open and catching the ball. Jaquan Jackson's kind of fits that bill. And by the way, roommates for the past 4 years, obviously not this past year, but the 4 previous ones, with Tajay Spears, another Tulane playmaker that made a lot of money for himself at the Senior Bowl. He showed out in the drills and got drafted maybe a bit higher than people initially thought he was going to. And then another guy I'll give you is Dwayne Carter, a defensive tackle out of Duke, who I think is an active 3-down lineman. Across 21 and 2022, showed a lot of pass rushing potential, combined for 10 sacks in those 2 seasons. He's an outstanding run stopper. He can play every position from 0 tech to 5 tech on the D-line. Duke asked him to do that. I think he settles in at 3 tech at the next level, which will be music to a lot of teams' ears, because you're always looking for dominant, 3 techs. Dwayne Carter is someone that really, really intrigues me. Active hands. And by the way, extremely mature, the most organized individual I came across throughout doing my Senior Bowl series that I spoke to 51 guys. No one, I think, was quite as mature and organized as Dwayne Carter was. He is going to crush the interview process down there. And oh yeah, it helps. He's a pretty damn good football player too.
Nice. Well, okay, so I have one more question, and I'll let you go. It's not really Senior Bowl related, but it's kind of tangentially related, so stick with me. You look around the NFL, it's 32 teams. You can go back to 2021, right? 32 offensive coordinators in the NFL. Fast forward 2 years to this offseason, there is not a single one of those offensive coordinators that is still in that job, which is insane. All 32 teams have a different offensive coordinator in 2023 than they had in 2021. That's through a variety of reasons, right? Whether the OC got fired, whether the head coach got fired and the new guy brought in somebody new, whether that offensive coordinator got hired somewhere else. It's, it all kind of combines into that. But I just think it's indicative of this more than ever short leash and change constantly in NFL coaching circles, coaching landscapes. And from someone who looks at prospects all the time, and like, it's like one of the things that I think people underappreciate when you're talking about prospects is that not every, those day one prospects, yeah, they're expected to show up right away. And sure, they could develop and become elite, but you feel like they're ready to go. Well, that's the difference between day one, day two, day three. Is day two, day three, these are guys who, you're like, well, I think if he develops a little physically, if he develops a little mentally, right, if you can get him in the system and coach him up, he will be a pro. And how good he can be, that's a question, but you'll find out over time. Well, I don't think that it's hard to explain to somebody why 3 coaches in 3 years is not good for a young player. Look at Daniel Jones and all the different offensive systems he's had to learn, and he's just getting off of his rookie deal. Like, that sets a guy back. And so my question for you, as the Draft Network analyst hat on your head, right? How impactful do you think that is on young players? And with this fuse seeming to get shorter and shorter and shorter every year, do you think some teams would benefit from staying the course a little longer, whether that be like, okay, you lost your offensive coordinator, elevate someone within the staff who can maintain that structure, or in the sense of like, well, our coach didn't give the returns that we thought after year 1 or year 2. Maybe we stick with him and see if that could continue. I just think one thing that drives me nuts about as these players get developed over time is like, you quit on a guy and you never really gave him a chance. And when you're turning over the coaching staff every 2 years, that seems to happen more and more. I'm just curious where you land on that.
I think this will be an appropriate answer to your question, but if we're talking about from an offensive base perspective, offensive minded especially, I think you've sort of seen the league respond to that, certainly over the past years and especially in this hiring cycle, by trending towards offensive minded head coaches. I think, right? I think that's one way you can guarantee that, especially for a quarterback, that if you lose the offensive coordinator, you're not going to be resetting it so much. And I'll give you an example from my own personal experience covering the Tennessee Titans, okay? Mike Vrabel, defensive-minded head coach, really, good coach by all accounts. He gets the job in 2018. He hires a hell of an offensive coordinator. Who does he hire? Floor, right? What happens when you're a great defensive-minded head coach with a great offensive coordinator? You lose him. He lost Matt LaFleur after 1 year. He hired from within, tried to maintain that continuity by hiring Arthur Smith. He knocked that hire out of the park as well. What happened? He lost him too, right? At some point, you're going to make a mistake when that keeps happening. He made his mistake when he hired Todd Downing, right? He fired him after 2 years. This past year, he hired Tim Kelly. There were other issues. I thought Tim Kelly did a good job. Other issues with the team. But Mike Vrabel had 4 offensive coordinators in 6 years, right? And by the time he ended up losing his job. That's just what happens when you're a defensive-minded head coach. So what did the Titans do? They hired Brian Callahan, an offensive-minded head coach who's going to install his system. Guess what? Doesn't matter if he loses offensive coordinator, right? Because that system's going to be in place because it's his system. It's not someone else's. You look around the league. The Los Angeles Chargers, they fired a defensive-minded head coach, right? They hired Harbaugh, an offensive-minded head coach. The Washington Commanders are probably waiting for Ben Johnson, right, to become available, the offensive coordinator of the Detroit Lions, right? The Atlanta Falcons are an exception. They hired Raheem Morris, but he's worked on the offensive side of the ball. One of those very few rare coaches that's worked. Of course, he's defensive-minded, but he's got experience on the offensive side, and he was in that Washington staff in 2010 that had Mike McDaniel, Sean McVay, and everyone, and he just worked with McVay again, and he's probably bringing a McVay disciple to be his OC in Atlanta. Look at some of the coaches that shockingly have not been hired this cycle. We all thought Bill Belichick was a shoo-in, right? Defensive-minded. When the Tennessee Titans fired Mike Vrabel, oh my God, Vrabel's going to get a job the second he gets fired. He hasn't gotten one. He got passed over potentially in Carolina for an offensive-minded head coach in Dave Canales with a lot less experience, right? So I think you can see what I'm saying here, how I'm answering your question. I think the league's response to that has sort of to make sure we are hiring more and more offensive-minded head coaches. So if we do lose our offensive coordinator, which happens all the time nowadays, because it's a pass-happy league, that system is still in place, and we're not asking our young quarterback like a Daniel Jones or a Will Levis. It happened to Justin Fields a lot in Chicago with a defensive-minded head coach and Matt Eberflus. that system stays in place and we have that continuity regardless of who the OC is. Because as you just said, that OC is going to change, right? 32 changes in 2 years. It's crazy to think about. Well, one way to offset that is to make sure the head coach has a system in place.
And it's funny you mentioned that, and then it's like you're like, okay, the Saints have a defensive head coach, the Bucks have a defensive head coach, like Raheem Morris, like he has experience on the opposite side of the ball. It's like almost the entire NFC South, and then Dave Canales over there in year one. But it's and that's an example of an offensive coordinator going to work for a defensive head coach and then immediately getting hired out from under him. So,
and what just happened to Todd Bowles, right? You just said it, right? Todd Bowles just lost his after one good year, right? He loses Dave Canales after one good year,
and it wasn't even that good. It was good. It was good, but it wasn't like, 2016 Matt Ryan good, right? Like it was like, oh, you got a lot out of Baker Mayfield, and that's impressive. Good job.
Right. I mean, I think he deserves a lot of credit, in all honesty, based on, that they sign a quarterback $4 million base salary, and you get Baker Mayfield to play the way he did. I think that probably went a lot better than anyone thought it would, right? So I understand the appeal to Dave Canales, and I hope that job works out for him in Carolina. There was a lot of red flags and warning signs to not take that job, but sometimes you got to take your opportunity when it comes. There's only 32 of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think David Tepper did a good job of narrowing that field out by throwing drinks on fans and firing head coach. Anyway, but all right, Justin Melo, senior draft analyst for the Draft Network. So a lot of great stuff on the Senior Bowl that's coming up on Tuesday. Really appreciate the time, man. A lot of great information in there.
Pleasure was all mine, Jeff. Thanks for having me on.
All right, thanks again to Justin Melo of the Draft Network. Always has so much insight to share. I always appreciate it because it's like, oh, how many, who have you talked to from that's going to be the Senior Bowl that you're interested in? He's like, I talked to about 57 people over the last 3 weeks. Like, what? How do you have that much time? Anyway, a lot of interesting stuff. One thing that he talked about there that toward the end that we can get into as we kind of shift gears into the OC search, which will be the next segment, is like, the idea of having offensive minded head coaches. It makes a lot more sense when you think about it in terms of consistency. And, we talked about Dan Campbell to open this episode. And I think one of the struggles for Dan Campbell now is going to be, okay, you built this culture and you established an offense that's very good and you're moving forward. But what happens when you lose Ben Johnson and you lose your offensive coordinator and then you got to replace him? Does it fall off? Can you maintain? And that's always going to be the struggle when you're not an offensive head coach. And, you could say the opposite. When you're a defensive head coach, you lose when you're an offensive head coach, you lose your defensive coordinator. But I just think the relationship in terms of offense, quarterback, play caller is so important. And that consistency is so important that being able to maintain that if you're a Kyle Shanahan is so much easier than a Dennis Allen, for example, or a Todd Bowles. Like Todd Bowles is trying to replace his offensive coordinator. Both teams are trying to replace their offensive coordinators. One fired him and one got hired away to be a head coach. And how does that affect Baker Mayfield, Derek Carr, two guys that are veterans that have no continuity with whoever's going to replace them? And that's why you'll see a lot of quarterbacks coach be elevated. And that's why you'll see a lot of quarterbacks coach hired away from other teams. And I just think it is interesting. Like you talk about offensive coordinators being head coaches. And I think it's like partially because they make good head coaches, but also partially because it allows you to, especially for a young quarterback, like if you're trying to develop a young quarterback and you give him 3 different offensive coordinators in 3 years, do you think that helps?
No, too many different chefs in in the kitchen, as they say. It'll be interesting though, because even if you just have that quarterback's coach experience or another assistant role being elevated, we've talked about this too, being a first-time offensive coordinator and having that responsibility on you, it's kind of tough to have that much confidence. You must have a hell of an interview to me to be able to lock that up with someone, instead of like if you're coming through the ranks with an organization, obviously they know you a lot better.
Yeah, right. And I think like that's why we'll talk about it more, but like there's a lot of candidates that you could hire for the Saints that it's like, I think they could be a good play caller, but I don't know.
Right.
We're basing this on like, yeah, he worked with, a really good offensive coordinator and can bring a lot of those themes, but they've never done it. So you're kind of guessing, and like we always talk about, like I talked about this, like everyone thinks like, okay, you can do this and it'll definitely work. But what if it doesn't work? Like things don't always work. The alternative is not always the right call just because the route you chose was the wrong one. And I think that's, we talk about it in fourth down situations. We could talk about it in offensive coordinator hires. All the same.
I think it is kind of amusing too. I think there's a lot of fans out there panicking that the Saints are losing out on everybody. And it's just like, calm down, pump the brakes.
I mean, I understand it, but like, I think right now there are 12 offense coordinator openings. So I don't know, but anyway, this was a Senior Bowl segment and we've completely lost track, but I do think like you're going to go out to the Senior Bowl and you're going to get a lot. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if the Saints hire someone during the Senior Bowl is what I'm saying. I think a lot of these hires kind of get their skids greased there. But anyway, let's wrap up this segment. We're going to come back. We're going to give you the latest updates in the offensive coordinator search. It'll be a quick segment because we've already been on here forever, but this is Inside Black and Gold. I'm Jeff Nowak. He is Steve Geller. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. We'll be right back. And we're back on Inside Black and Gold. I'm Jeff Nowak. He is Steve Geller. You mentioned how the length of time in this offensive coordinator search, and I do think that's interesting. We're going to get into the latest updates of the offensive coordinator here. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned this. It's like there's 12 teams that are hiring an offensive coordinator right now. If the idea is the Saints are taking such a long time, then it's like those other teams are taking just as much time to hire an offensive coordinator. And the interesting thing is Mike Thomas mentioned this and said, why do you think no one's taking the job? And I don't know how much actual insight he has into how these interview processes are going, but that's going to be the question. Like, I don't think these first three that aren't on the board anymore is really a sign of that. But the rest of the guys on the board who don't necessarily have these ties to other guys, if they start turning down the job, then I think you can start to point to that and be like, questionable.
And it's a good question though too. It's like, has anyone really turned down the job? We know people have interviewed, but I don't believe anything the Saints have offered anybody and been turned down kind of thing.
I mean, I don't. Well, so there's 9 names, I want to say. Let's see.
That the Saints have interviewed?
Yes. There are 9 names on here that they have either interviewed or requested to interview. I don't know if they ever actually interviewed Shane Waldron, but like there's 3 names that are already off the board. And again, all 3, like people are going to say, well, this is a sign that other jobs are more attractive and no one wants to coach the Saints. And maybe, but it's not really, I mean, no, I don't think we have to explain. We talked about this, like the Bears have the number 1 overall pick. I think there were probably people lining up for that job. Like
what's crazy too is just with the Saints though, not even considering draft, salary cap as is, how is this not an attractive offense to step into? That's wild to me.
I mean, I don't think, like from an ownership perspective, I think there's support. Like I don't know, like you could say that maybe no one wants to coach with DA. I don't know, but like that's probably the argument you're making. But so there's 3 names that are off the board. So Shane Waldron took the job as the Bears offensive coordinator. He was the former Seahawks offensive coordinator. He was high on my list, but I understand it's like the Bears hired him quickly.
We're going to get our quarterback.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a sign to me that he was like, I want Caleb Williams, and they were like, we'll go get him.
Okay.
So I think Justin Fields going to end up getting traded. Next up, Zach Robinson. So he was the quarterbacks coach under Sean McVay this past season. The Falcons hired Raheem Morris, and that kind of did it for the Saints in terms of like, I don't know how you can if he wants to go with his former coworker and be his offensive coordinator, I don't know how you compete with that.
Right. So they're gonna team up.
Yeah. Like it's not a 1-for-1 thing. Like when you get to points where these 2 teams are on even footing and he's picking one over the other, then you can have that conversation. But I don't think any of these examples would do that because again, it's like, I almost feel like it was a twofer. Like they hired Raheem Morris and Zach Robinson in one fell swoop.
Right.
Because that's the guy Raheem wanted, and he probably talked to him in advance. I'm like, I'm going to get this job. You want to come be my offensive coordinator? Let's do it. Anyway, so that's another one off the board. And a popular name. I do wonder what would have happened if the Falcons didn't hire Raheem Morris. And then if he still went to be the offensive coordinator for the Falcons, then that would be an interesting one. But the next one is former Bengals quarterbacks coach Dan Pitcher. He was promoted to the Bengals offensive coordinator job.
Right. What you going to do there? Come on.
again, it's like, and so the names remaining: Ronald Curry, Saints quarterbacks coach; Mike Sullivan, Steelers quarterbacks coach, interim offensive coordinator; Brian Greasy, the 49ers quarterbacks coach, also former NFL quarterback; Clint Kubiak, the 49ers pass game specialist, and the most recent name added to the list is former Eagles offensive coordinator Brian Johnson.
I'm curious if the Niners now extended run kind of puts some of the things on the back burner for Greasy and Kubiak if the Saints are really that interested in them.
I think it has to this point. I think that made it a little more complicated, but I think this is the week. This open week is when you can do that. Is when you can, because there's 2 weeks between the championship games and the Super Bowl, and so I think this is where the rubber meets the road for these guys, because there's an understanding that teams need to make a move. Teams need to figure it out, and so I have a feeling if you're going to have a second interview with either of those guys, it would happen this week. The only guy who I know they've been trying to get a second interview with is Gerard Johnson, who's the Texans quarterbacks coach.
Right.
And he's another guy who, like these first 3 names on the list, more like Dan Pitcher, really. If Bobby Slowick gets hired as a head coach, who's the Texans offensive coordinator, then I would expect Gerard Johnson to be promoted to offensive coordinator. And I think that one of the reasons that timing is difficult there is because he's probably waiting. Because I think anyone who likes where they're at would prefer to get promoted than leave and start new somewhere else.
Yeah, I get to keep working with CJ Stroud. Sure, I'll do that.
Right, exactly. For the same reason that Shane Waldron was like, yeah, Caleb Williams, sign me up.
Right.
So, I think the Lions losing could speed things up a little bit in that regard, because I do think Ben Johnson is going to get hired probably to the Commander's job, and you were probably waiting until after this week. Maybe you would wait after the Super Bowl if they had made the Super Bowl. They didn't. So if Ben Johnson gets hired to be the Commander's head coach, then that would only leave one opening left. And I think
Seattle.
I don't know how much Bobby Slowick is in contention for that role, but I like, if Bobby doesn't get hired, then I think Gerard Johnson becomes available. So we'll see. Brian Johnson is interesting. RPO concepts, I think, are something the Saints don't do enough of, and I would like to see them do more of it. You don't have to have a mobile quarterback to run RPO. Yeah. The Eagles won a Super Bowl with Nick Foles doing RPO.
I know there were some Saints fans dreaming of Joe Brady coming back to the Louisiana. That's not happening. He's going to be the OC in Buffalo, and they're not prying him away from the Bills at all.
Yeah, no surprise there. I mean,
right.
I was hoping that the Bills would make the wrong decision and give the Saints an opening. But yeah, they never interviewed Joe Brady. I think everyone could have seen that coming. Like, it wasn't even necessarily worth going down that road of like requesting interviews, because he was always going to be that guy. But yeah, I mean, that's where you're at. And, if I had my pick, it would probably be Clint Kubiak, because I just think the way the 49ers operate on offense is something I want. That said, I think everyone's kind of acting as if hiring Ronald Curry would be a cop-out. But like, as we talked about, it's like some consistency in the coaching staff is helpful. And my other argument would be, if you, like, halfway through the season, everyone was telling me that they need to fire Pete and make Ronald Curry the offensive coordinator. So what's changed in terms of, I have 2 questions. One, do you think Ronald Curry can be an offensive coordinator in the NFL? And if the answer is yes, do you want Ronald Curry to be your offensive coordinator or someone else's? Because I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Bucs request an interview with Ronald Curry, if the Panthers request an interview with Ronald Curry, because if I know one thing, it's that teams love to strengthen their own position while hurting another team. Like, that's a benefit. And that's what would happen. And Ronald Curry has been getting interviewed for these jobs. Like, Ronald Curry was interviewed by the Bucs last year. He's going to get an OC job eventually. He's not going to be the Saints quarterbacks coach forever. And if he goes and coaches the Bucs, not only do you kind of lose that on your staff, a guy that everyone really likes and appreciates and speaks very highly of, you now have the offensive coordinator for the Bucs having very intimate knowledge of how your offense operates and your quarterback. I don't like that idea.
That's another, like, I think you might have brought this up before when we've talked about these. Part of these this interview process too is getting intel for the future, not just for your current job opening that you might have. Whether you do this with free agents and the coaches, like you're getting good knowledge for, just whoever lands with another team as well.
That's definitely true. That's definitely true. And I don't know, like, I don't know how much of that is true. Like, I don't think you interviewed Brian Greasy just to get intel on Clint Kubiak. Maybe you did. But if I'm Brian Greasy, I'm like, what the hell, guys? Why would you do that?
Or just even a chance to even get a little, if you're not even going to hire them, just let me know a little more about how the Niners tick kind of thing.
I think it also, it's just an opportunity for you to kind of get an idea of how you are perceived around the league too.
Right. Right.
Like, cause you're just asking them questions and getting answers, and, you're not inside of these buildings, and you just, it's all information collection. But, I don't think the Saints are, so, I knew that you knew the Saints were going to be methodical and go through their process and whatnot. And I don't think right now that you are behind the 8 ball in terms of getting a hire mate. I think you can see the 8 ball, and, you just have to pick a path around it. Now, if you don't do that fast enough now, then you could get into trouble, because like there's a lot of teams that are all kind of getting to that point now. And I don't want to be the last in my own division to hire an offensive coordinator. And I don't want to put myself in a situation where, I'm bidding against somebody else if I can avoid it. I think the Senior Bowl is probably where I would be surprised if we get through the Senior Bowl and the Saints don't have an offensive coordinator hired. Because I just think that's where everyone's going to be. Like there's something to be said for being in the same place as someone else.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
And so we'll see. But I think that a lot of that's going to be the thing is like, okay, you're interested in this guy, but this other team is interested in this guy. So where does he choose? And to this point, I don't think you've seen an offensive coordinator candidate that the Saints were trying to get hired away by someone that was on an even footing as you. For these guys, other than Gerard Johnson, if he ends up being promoted, that's exactly what it would be. So,
yeah, I think for me, I think the Saints are fine where they are right now. They might get a little antsy. Like if someone were to hire away Ronald Curry, like right now the Bucs did that, you're like, well, oh crap, our in-house candidate's gone. We better make our move really freaking quick now.
And just to further that Ronald Curry point, like, you know how bad it's going to look if Ronald Curry gets hired away and suddenly like the Bucs offense takes off and he's the hot coaching candidate. Meanwhile, you hire some hot name that everyone's like, oh, go get that guy. And he flames out. And it's like, like you can look at it and say like, whatever, you're being crazy. But I guarantee you the Saints front office is looking at it like, we developed this guy for this. Like, this is the guy we brought up. We like him. And someone else is going to get him to be their offensive coordinator.
Right.
Because if they're willing to hire him, why aren't we?
You know what I do find a little bit odd? Like, remember the hot name forever was Eric Bieniemy, and now nobody's talking about him?
Yeah, that is strange.
Just
part of me wonders if he's just done being an offensive coordinator. He's like, hire me as a head coach or leave me alone.
It's just one of those I thought was odd. Like, I even thought would be on the Saints list to interview for OC and nothing.
Yeah. Well, they did last time.
Right. And so maybe, I guess, yeah, they saw what they needed to out of him, I guess. I don't know.
Actually, did they? I might have misspoken there. I think they interviewed him last time, but that was for a head coaching job. That was when they were going through the post-Sean search. I don't think they interviewed him technically to be the offensive coordinator. I could be wrong, but there's a lot of interesting ones. Like Arthur Smith is interviewing for a couple jobs. Ron Rivera is in the running for a couple defensive coordinator jobs. This is the point where you're cannibalizing all of these, like you're picking apart the remnants of these staffs that have been kind of blown up and just floating away in the water.
I do find it amusing too. It hasn't been that quick that there's still no movement on Pete Carmichael to Denver yet.
I mean, he might want a year off. He's been coaching nonstop for like 2 decades. Maybe he wants a year to hang out with his family.
The last thing I want to is Sean yelling at me again.
Yeah. I do wonder if Sean will be in Mobile. That'd be interesting.
That is a good question, right?
The other thing that we can mention before we get out of here. So Chris Richard. So Ryan Nielsen, first off, got hired as the Jags offensive coordinator. So he's just a good example of a guy who kind of went to a staff on a guy who was kind of on his last legs as head coach, which you can confirm now because Arthur Smith got fired. They went 7-10, he got fired. But he still took that job and he did a good job and he got hired in Jacksonville pretty quickly, I might add. So like if this idea that, no one's going to come coach with Dennis Allen because he might get fired at the end of the year.
Come on.
I mean, the guys take, if someone's going to, give you a shitload more money and an opportunity to prove you can be an offensive coordinator, it doesn't necessarily have to be the head coach that succeeds. You can succeed independently of that. And that's what Ryan Nielsen is doing. And he's over in Jacksonville. And what I thought was interesting was I did wonder at the time whether there were grievances between Ryan Nielsen and Chris Pichard in New Orleans, because they were co-defensive coordinators and then they both departed in the same year. And I was curious whether maybe there was something there, but clearly not, because Chris is going to coach with Ryan. So
they're getting the band back together.
But they're not co-defensive coordinators. Ryan is Chris's boss this time, which is something that they weren't willing to do in New Orleans.
Right.
If they were, exactly. If they had done that, maybe Ryan Nielsen would be the defensive coordinator right now in New Orleans, and Chris Richard would still be the secondary coach. Because that's what's happening down there.
Everyone just stealing from the Saints, man. Now Saxonville is going to be what the Saints' plans was.
Yeah, but they're not going to force any turnovers.
Right. No, they're just right. Just get sacks.
They're going to get sacks, but no turnovers. And they're probably going to draft an Ellis. I do wonder, so it's like, okay, do the Jaguars go and trade for Caden Ellis, or like when you make a big splash in free agency the way the Falcons did, it's like it's for a reason, and now that reason is in Jacksonville.
Right, him and Onyemata are like, so Ryan.
Well, the Jags, the Falcons are not spending big in free agency like they did on Onyemata and Ellis. If it's not Ryan Nielsen saying, "I want these guys," okay,
right, exactly.
So now they have these guys, and I mean they're good players. But like I don't think that the new defensive coordinator is going to have any allegiances to them. So it'll be interesting to see if maybe they get traded away.
We'll take them both back in New Orleans, honestly.
I'll take Caden. David, I like David. David's not moving the needle for me anymore. You know who I'll take back in New Orleans? CJ Gardner-Johnson. Even though he's still doing his wave into the crowd thing way too early.
Way too early, bro. Came back and bit you in the ass there for sure.
Yeah, not a great look. He also got stiff-armed into the crust of the earth.
CMC put him down.
That's the problem. When you're like, you need guys who are going to be willing tacklers and run up and not be afraid. But it's like you end up on a poster in the NBA, but it's really just like, yeah, you were willing to play defense in a situation where you probably should have just gotten out of the way. And that's like, yeah, CJ's going up and trying to make a real tackle on CMC, and he paid the price for it. But like, if he just went for the ankle and missed, everyone would be like, well, why didn't he try to make a real tackle? Why didn't he try to put a hit on him?
And honestly, I love CJ Gardner-Johnson, but he had a pretty lame hit on Debo.
Yeah, CJ's that guy where it's like when he's on your team, you love him. When he's on anyone else's team, you hate him.
You're like, yeah, what a dick.
Like Marcus Smart, Patrick Beverly in the NBA, like these guys exist. Josh Norman was like that, And I don't think that the Saints would even look twice at CJ in free agency. I just think that bridge has been burned. But it's just funny because it's like your biggest need is a slot corner, or at least one of your biggest needs is a slot corner. And like a premier slot corner is going to be available and had his market go down dramatically since you refused to give him the deal that no one else would either. So I just like it would be so. I wish for the sake of the Saints they could just be like, hey, can we just get this to work? What do you think?
But then you're almost in a Michael Thomas situation there, and you know it. Like kind of you want to, but you know the situation's probably not going to end up right.
I think it's different on defense. I do. I really do. Because it's just not, you don't have the, like, you don't have target share. You don't have decisions being made. Like, he's going to be on the field. You know that. So it's not like usage would be a problem. I don't know. I think you could figure it out. I think you could.
If I got my choice, I'm definitely taking Gardner Johnson. No doubt.
Yeah. I don't know. It's just funny to me because it's like, that would like every fan would be like, yes, please. But I don't know if any like in that locker room.
Right. They might like, oh crap.
It's this guy again.
Man, he's always talking shit.
Yeah. I mean, he got punched in the face by Mike Thomas. Like, I mean, I remember
guy that's constantly yapping. You're like, dude, do you ever be quiet? And God forbid you say something to him because then he's just going to be on your shit constantly.
I remember Traquan Smith. He did an interview on WWL after he signed an extension a couple of years ago, and he was like talking about how even in practice, CJ would be like just giving him shit for like missing a catch, and like it's like that's practice.
Right.
Like he's going at you in practice. And I like personally, I was like, I think that helps the offense. I think like you're basically training against the ultimate like mind ninja.
Right, right.
And then when it happens in a game, you're just like, you're not saying anything worse than what he said.
Right.
When it wasn't even a game.
This punk's nothing compared to CD Deuce.
Right. I've heard all this before. Anyway, all right, let's wrap this up. This has been a long pod. We went through Mike Thomas, we went through the Senior Bowl, we went through offensive coordinator, and I'm sure by the time this posts, it'll all be dated.
There you go, right.
That's the danger of recording podcasts at any point, but particularly this time of year, because if the Saints decide to hire an offensive coordinator in the next 12 hours, then this podcast will have to be deleted. But hey, this
podcast will self-destruct.
Yeah. Oh, I just I'm speaking of which, I just watched the new Mission Impossible. Have you seen that?
I have not.
Okay. Well, there's a really funny scene where they are talking about how they're talking to like one of the government officials, and they're like, what do you mean whenever you can't figure something out, you just leave a message for some random person and he solves your problem for you? And they're like, well, yeah, but only if he chooses to accept it. That's why it was funny.
So what did you think? Because I kept hearing it was like one of the best action movies.
It was good. It was really good.
Okay.
Do you know he works for the IMF? That's what it's called. Like the group that like organizes his stuff and like sends him messages. They're called the IMF.
What's that stand for? No.
Well, yeah, that's what it's called. And in this movie, and this spoiler, in this movie, they tell you that it stands for, because there's another joke where he's like, what do you mean, International Monetary Fund? What does that mean? He's like, Impossible Mission Force.
Oh.
So
okay.
Bad. But no, it's a good movie. Like I really did enjoy it. I always forget, like Tom Cruise is such a weirdo, but like he's so good in these movies that it's like he hits that kind of mark for me of like I can look past how much of a psycho he is just because he's so good, like Top Gun.
Yeah, I enjoyed that. I mean, it was one of those, I was probably late to the party with everybody, recommending how great it was, and I was like, all right, let's go check it out. And it still lived up to all the hype, so I appreciated it.
But yeah, so that's where we're at now with the Saints is Mission Impossible offensive coordinator search. Mission Impossible, get Mike Thomas targets.
Like you said, have fun with Josh Allen in Buffalo.
He sure will. We'll see. But anyway, this is Inside Black and Gold. Thanks everyone for listening all the way to the end. Again, I don't understand why anyone ever does that, but hey, we appreciate it. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. we're almost we'll be officially turning the calendar over to year 3 after the Super Bowl. So that's crazy, right? This is going to be the third year. We've gotten through year 2 of this podcast.
Cheers, clank.
The terrible 2s are over. Now
into the prosperous 3s.
into the thirsty 3s. Thirsty 3s days. Anyway,
Go.
who dat? Go Saints.
This podcast will self-destruct in 5, 4.
You got to finish it.
I was just letting the countdown go.
Say 3,
3, 2, 1.